Title: Wuthering Heights. Author: Emily Brune. Genre: Tragedy, Gothic. Firstly, I want to tell family relationship. First, family. Mr. Earnshaw and Mrs. Earnshaw. They have two children, namely Hindley and Catherine. Hindley is married to Frances Earnshaw, and they have son namely Hareton Earnshaw. Catherine is Hindley's young sister. The second family, Mr. Linton and Mrs. Linton. They have two children, namely Edgar Linton and Isabella Linton. Edgar is married to Catherine Earnshaw, and they have daughter, namely Kathy Linton. Isabella is married to Heathcliff, and they have son, namely Linton Heathcliff. Characters: Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw is a parent from Hindley and Catherine. Mr. Earnshaw is the master of Wuthering Heights at the beginning of Nellie's story and is described as an irascible but loving and kind-hearted man. Mr. and Mrs. Linton, Edgar's and Isabella's parents, they educate their children in a well-behaved and sophisticated way. Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw as the main characters. Nellie Dean, or Ellen, is the main narrator of the novel. Nellie is a servant to three generations of the Earnshaw and two of the Linton family. Mr. Lockwood, the first narrator, he ran through Cross Grange to escape society, but in the end, decided society is preferable. Joseph is a servant at Wuthering Heights for 60 years, who is a rigid, self-righteous Christian but lacks any trace of genuine kindness or humanity. He speaks a broad Yorkshire dialect and hates nearly everyone in the novel. The story. Wuthering Heights itself is the name of the mansion of Yorkshire, England. Initially, Wuthering Heights was owned by Mr. Earnshaw. After his business trip in Liverpool, Mr. Earnshaw brings home a dirty gypsy boy who is hanging out on the street. The child was given the name Heathcliff, his name as the name of his son who had died due to illness. Heathcliff's presence in the Earnshaw family turned out to be the beginning of disaster in this family. Earnshaw's favoritism to love Heathcliff more than his own two children planted seed and of hatred and envy in the mind of his eldest son, Hindley. Unlike Hindley, Catherine's attitude toward Heathcliff is very good, because they both have an adventurous spirit. They quickly become close. Because of this discord, Hindley is eventually sent to college, but he returns 3 years later. When Mr. Earnshaw died, he is with a new wife, Frances, become a master of Wuthering Heights, and forced Heathcliff to become a servant instead of a member of the family. Heathcliff and Catherine spy on Edgar Linton and his sister Isabella, children who live nearby at Cross Grange. Catherine is attacked by their dog, and the Linton take her in, sending Heathcliff home. When the Linton visit, Hindley and Edgar make fun of Heathcliff and fight ensues. Heathcliff is locked in the attic and vows revenge. Frances dies after giving birth to son Hareton. 2 years later, Catherine becomes engaged to Edgar. She confesses to Nellie that she loves Heathcliff and will try to help but cannot marry him because of his low social status. Nellie warns her against the plan. Heathcliff overhears part of the conversation and, misunderstanding Catherine's heart, flees the household. Catherine falls ill, distraught. Edgar and Catherine marry, and 3 years later, Heathcliff unexpectedly returns. Now a wealthy gentleman, he encourages Isabella's infatuation with him as means of revenge on Catherine. Enraged by Heathcliff's constant presence at Cross Grange, Edgar cuts off contact. Catherine responds by locking herself in her room and refusing food. Pregnant with Edgar's child, she never fully recovers. At Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff gambles with Hindley, who mortgages and property to him to pay his debts. Heathcliff elopes with Isabella, but the relationship fails and they soon
returns. When Heathcliff discovers that Catherine is dying, he visits her in secret. She dies shortly after giving birth to a daughter, Katie, and Heathcliff ranges, calling on her ghost to haunt him for as long as he lives. Isabella flees south where she gives birth to Heathcliff's son, Linton. Hindley dies 6 months later, leaving Heathcliff as a master of wuthering hate. On her 16th birthday, Katie and Ellen strayed onto Heathcliff's land, and he invited them into Wuthering Heights to see Linton. Katie was pleased to renew her acquaintance, and Heathcliff was eager to promote romance between the two cousins, so as to ensure himself to of Edgar's land when he died. When they returned home, Edgar forbade Katie to continue visiting there, and said that Heathcliff was an evil man. Katie then began a secret correspondence with Linton, which became an exchange of love letters. Ellen found out and put an end to it. Edgar became ill. Heathcliff asked Katie to return to Wuthering Heights because Linton was breaking his heart for her. She did so, and found Linton to be a bullying invalid, but not without charms. Ellen fell ill as well as was unable to prevent Katie from visiting Wuthering Heights every day. Katie felt obliged to help Linton, and despised Harrington for being clumsy and illiterate. Ellen told Edgar about the visits when she found out, and he forbade Katie to go any more. Edgar was in poor health and didn't know about Linton's equally bad health and bad characters, so he thought it would be good for Katie to marry him, since Linton and not Katie would most likely inherit the Grange. A system was fixed up in which Linton and Katie met outside. Linton was increasingly ill and seems to be terrified of something. As it turned out, his father was forcing him to court Katie. Heathcliff feared Linton would die before Edgar did, so eventually he all but kidnapped Katie and Ellen, and told them Katie couldn't go home to see her dying father until she married Linton. Katie did marry Linton and escaped in time to see Edgar before he died. After Edgar's funeral, he was buried next to his wife. Heathcliff schemes to ensure that they marry, and on Edgar's death, demands that the couple move in with him. He becomes increasingly wild and reveals that on the night Catherine died, he dug up her grave and ever since has been plagued by her ghost. When Linton dies, Katie has no option but to remain at Wuthering Heights. Emily Brontë used this frame story technique to narrate most of the story. Thus, for example, Lockwood, the first narrator of the story, tells the story of Nellie, who herself tells the story of another character. From a combination of two speakers who outline the event of the plot within the framework of a story within a story. The frame story is that of Lockwood, who informs us of his meeting with the strange and mysterious family living in almost total isolation in the stony, uncultivated land of northern England. The inner story is that of Nellie Dane, who transmits to Lockwood the history of the two families during the last two generations. Nellie Dane examined the event retrospectively and attempts to report them as an objective eyewitness to Lockwood.